Hi, everyone. Glad you could join us. I'm Richard Poor.
And I'm Rick Meager.
Our show is the inevitable evolution of Democrats to communists, with that word evolution being key. And it applies to our show, too. So we hope you caught us last week when we laid out a couple of dozen actions and attitudes by the Democrats.
Promoting reliance on long-term taxpayer support with no concerns about consequences, particularly the national debt, which now stands at over $500,000 for every tax-paying family of four. If you didn't hear it, we hope you'll take 18 minutes to listen on democratstocommunists.com.
Today we're looking at communism, how communal living was part of early America, and the evolution of the Democratic Party platform from its founding to today. And of course, what's with that jackass?
Yeah, hard to know how the Democrats got where they are if we don't know where they were. But let's start with communism. Why would anyone think that that's something to trend toward instead of away from?
We're going to get into more detail on that, but the basic premise is that by everybody sharing everything, the working and living fields are all leveled, and everyone is better off. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who still believe this fairy tale in spite of all the evidence that it just doesn't work.
I guess it might, if we were all lemmings, willing to be led and just be told what to do.
Yeah, but it also presumes everyone always does their best, no matter the benefit. And even then, someone gets to be the commander telling everyone what is best for them, a la Hitler or Kim Jong-un.
Fortunately, we aren't lemmings, and most of us want freedom to think and do on our own, which is what has made this great country, by the way.
Of course, as we mentioned last time, Democrats won't ever call themselves communists, and certainly won't admit they're going that direction. But that just doesn't change the reality. Heck, they don't call themselves socialists either, but they already have leaders who are, and most of their platform is socialistic.
As we said, we'll prove that at the rate of change in their policies and practices, it's only a matter of time. Likely before the end of this decade, before their publicized agenda is even more aligned with communism than socialism. This all stems from striving to be everything to everyone.
Yeah, so consider communism. It's been around for thousands of years, certainly practiced by nomadic societies. Until people lived in permanent dwellings, they shared food, shelter, defense, pretty much everything. As people became more settled, though, they were able to produce more than they could carry, and they traded the excess. If you had a valuable skill for pottery making or arrows or trading horses, whatever, you gained some measure of wealth.
And let me guess, as soon as some people got ahead, Democrats swooped in to claim their fair share.
Hold on, cowboy. You're getting ahead of us.
Fine. Since sharing everything was no longer necessary, when did communism become this philosophical or idealistic concept?
Well, Rick, the first written mention of communal living we can find is that the followers of Pythagoras, of a philosopher, and he was also a mathematician, from about 2,500 years ago, lived together and they shared everything, including all property. But that was just a small group within the midst of a larger Republican Greek society. The first mainstream adoption of pure communism really surprised us.
Yeah, totally, Richard. In the New Testament of the Bible, it says early Christians sold everything they had and shared the proceeds among the group. And this was the norm. The lifestyles in these communities were confirmed in later Roman and Jewish accounts and were even referred to multiple times by Karl Marx as models of modern communism.
Wow, I'm surprised we haven't heard some liberal use that to get us to drink their Kool-Aid.
Oh, just give them time. They just haven't thought of it. Yet.
Well, let's jump to the earliest European settlements in America to see how people thought and lived, which in turn, of course, shaped their politics. We're talking about the 15 and 1600s now.
Yeah, even though most early settlers did have permanent homes, they were still self-reliant and self-sufficient. They depended on their communities for protection and produced just about everything they needed to survive. So those settlements were absolutely communal. When it came to avoiding starvation or dying some other way, there was a lot of shared effort. and Native American societies operated much the same way.
Yeah, most immigrant factions were formed around religious beliefs, and they were so flippin' conservative, it makes today's right wing seem ultra liberal.
Yeah, we think of bigotry as racial, but early immigrant America was built on the back of religious, class, gender, and racial prejudices. It was decades before the Puritans came to Massachusetts, but they were just as intolerant. Catholics and Jews were banned, and they hanged 4 Quakers in Boston just for coming into town.
And contrary to the whitewashed accounts of the first Thanksgiving we all learned in school, everyone hated the Indians.
And here we thought today's cancel culture was harsh.
Yeah, we wouldn't even recognize society back then. If you didn't work, you died. If you didn't produce something, you died. With no police, you wind up in the wrong place at the wrong time, you died.
I keep reading that a big part of the infrastructure package being worked on by the Democrats is to make sure everyone has access to the internet. Interesting perspective that back then, people worried about access to enough food and shelter to survive.
Yeah, and most didn't. The survival rate for the earliest communities was less than 50%. There were no government-sponsored social programs, so it made sense they shared what they could.
Yeah, social support, if any, was voluntary and community or church-based, not government-supported. Social services and welfare and free education just didn't exist.
So let's jump forward a couple of hundred years. The first self-styled communists in America were the Shakers, who came over from England in 1774. They owned everything in common and were moderately successful, eventually with 18 communities and several thousand members. But they had a pretty major problem. One of their founding principles was celibacy. Sex was considered a sin.
Not sure how the founder came up with that one, but it made them dependent on conversion from other religions. As you can imagine, as that slowed, their membership literally died out.
We know this was an incredibly divisive time, still talking of the late 1700s, for what was about to become the United States. About 20% of citizens were loyalists, still loyal to King George. Slavery was a scourge, and there was huge disagreement over how much authority the federal government should have over the states and over individuals.
Well, that part hasn't changed.
Yeah, about the only things in common were that everyone hated taxation and Indians, and most hated Catholics and Jews.
But there were other idealists who envisioned perfect societies. We're familiar with Marx and his famous slogan of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
Yeah, you know that was a bastardization though, right, Rick?
Bastardization. Cool word. Yeah, it was a bastardization of an earlier writing. The original said, from each according to his abilities to each according to his work.
Work. Big difference. Huge. A Frenchman named Rouvroy, who actually fought in our Revolutionary War, coined that phrase. When he went back to France, he formed a radical socialist society. A few decades later, in 1825, a wealthy guy named Robert Owen wanted to build the, quote, perfect society. This was before Oneida, Brook Farm, and some other famous communes we may have heard about. He actually bought a town and invited people to come and explore their intellectual curiosity while living in communal bliss.
So, did it work?
Well, that kind of depends on how you define success. He actually got a group of scientists to relocate from Philadelphia. They came to New Harmony, Indiana, and actually came up with some great ideas like the 8-hour workday and eliminating child labor, even though these wouldn't be adopted for almost 80 years. Unfortunately, Owen burned through all his money really fast.
So, it didn't work.
Well, ultimately, Rick, the problem was he couldn't get most of the people to do any work. Since everything they needed was being provided, they just sat around reading, drawing, and supposedly drinking.
Sounds like our current labor market. With this latest round of stimulus payouts and excess unemployment benefits, businesses are definitely having trouble getting people to work.
Yeah, there's a lesson in there for sure. This was all during what was called the era of good feelings. It was a pretty bizarre period of about 15 years in the early 1800s when the Democratic Republican Party controlled about 85% of Congress. It's hard to imagine. In fact, the presidential election in 1820 only had one major candidate.
Wow, had that ever happened?
Now, the only other time was George Washington's first election. There was no major competition for him either. But then the election in 1824 had four candidates. And even though Andrew Jackson received the largest number of popular votes, he didn't get a majority. So the House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams.
Wow, this made people mad, and they started organizing. So in 1828, Jackson ran as the man of the people, and his party was being called the Jacksonian Democrats. He won in a landslide.
And on his inauguration day, his wife opened the White House to everyone who wanted to come. Over 20,000 drunken idiots showed up.
Yeah, the damage took over 6 months and thousands of dollars to repair. Mrs. Jackson later said they never got the cigar smell out of the drapes or the cheese smell out of the carpets.
That sounds like our kind of party.
So, Jackson is where our evolution of Democrats to communists really begins. Their original platform was hardly like it is today. About the only similarity was in support of the common man.
Yeah, but with man being key. Oh, and as long as that man was white.
So the earliest Democrats supported Jackson, who owned dozens of slaves, signed the Indian Removal Act, was a bigamist, and extremely conservative.
Yeah, I'll say, compared to today's liberals, moderates, and even conservatives, the political, ethical, and cultural persuasion of the first Democrats was narrow-minded and ultra-conservative.
But two quick things about Jackson that are worth noting. He appointed officials based on merit, not whether or not they supported him. And he was the only president to ever pay off the national debt.
That sure doesn't sound like a Democrat. Oh, come to think of it, it doesn't sound like a Republican either.
Anyway, the official name, the Democratic Party of the United States, was being promoted after his election and was official by the 1840 election. And the next few election cycles dealt more and more with westward expansion, with the states' rights, and the whole slavery issue.
With the Republican Party surprisingly supporting abolition back then, and the Democratic Party being the one that opposed it.
And everyone opposing Indians.
Yeah. Hey, Rick, I just noticed we're approaching 15 minutes. Why don't we wrap this one up as part one?
Richard, that's a great idea. We want to respect your time and we appreciate you joining us. Please stay tuned for part 2 of evolving into everything for everyone following this episode.
I'm Richard Poor.
And I'm Rick Meager.
We're Poor Richard and Meager Rick.
See you on the next one.